It is Friday, November 30th, 2018. Today's episode of This Is Not Life is going to talk about secret origins. We all have them. Some of us have secret origins in different countries. Some of us have secret origins in multiple countries. Some of us have secret origins in a police record book somewhere. That's why they're secret, because the police isn't supposed to share them with everyone all the time. But I got a secret one that has nothing to do with other countries or the police, thankfully. So stick around, because you're going to learn all the secrets. Because this is not life. Because this is Adam S. Messinger. Because play the music, Kevin.
If you're reading saga or crying from the muir, he'll deliver a sunset flip, so hold secure. He's got comic books and wrestling all night. This is not life with Adam Messinger. Adam S. Messinger.
Welcome to episode 44. I've done 44 of these things, and it's difficult because I feel like I have not hit my stride. Like, I haven't honed into just that one thing that I'm like, here it is, and it's good. And I stick with the whole practice makes perfect thing. That's why I'm doing this. That's why I still do this, because I'm hoping by episode 200 I might be okay. And it's frustrating. I don't know if I said it's frustrating, but it's fucking frustrating. And I've got all those fucking insecurities and all that shit as I'm like recording this, and I'm hoping it doesn't make me sound fake. And just all that shit floating around in my head. To the point to where I am supposed to come up with something, because I want to hit my deadline, which is, putting out an episode by Friday, making sure I give our editor, Kevin, the time that he needs to edit things. Yet I can't come up with a topic for either the wrestling segment or the comic segment or whatever, because I'm just analyzing it. I'm just, what should I do? What should I do? What should I do? Instead of, especially recently since I've gone monthly. When I was doing it 3 times a week, back in the early days of this, I would lay out a month's worth at a time. And then once the surgery happened, I had to take some time off and come back. I just kind of, I'd wing it. And that's not necessarily the best thing to do. Because then I'm fucking stuck with times like this where I'm like, what do I talk about? But it hit me earlier, as I'm pretty sure the only people listening to this are my editor and my beautiful, wonderful girlfriend. And I should just have conversations with you guys. And if there's other people listening, that's cool. So as I said at the top of the show, I want to talk about secret origins. Basically today, I'm going to talk about how I both got into wrestling and how I got into comics. And I figure it'd be kind of nice to get to know you guys a little better. And maybe you'll learn something from this, and maybe, I don't know. I don't know. It just seemed like the kind of the thing to do. Something that I feel like I could kind of break that insecurity and all the thoughts and shit and just speak a lot more naturally about it. So, I currently live in Northern California, as you know. But I didn't always live there. I started out, I was born in West Virginia, and then we moved to Ohio. And I guess in Ohio is when I discovered superheroes and superhero cartoons and all that stuff. My mom tells a story that once upon a time, we were in a supermarket, and I was 2, and I decided that this Superman action figure was fucking rad, and I cried until I got it. And my mom, being my mom, was like, well, I can't let him cry and not have this figure because he's too cute and he really wants it, so here you go. So she gets it for me. And this is back in the days. Nobody probably remembers this except for the older folks, if you're any older folk are listening to this. But back then, the supermarket actually had decent figures. It was very akin to like Walgreens' figure section now, except it was smaller and in a supermarket. So my dad finds out that I've got the Superman action figure, and that's kind of where it comes out that he kind of took the ball and ran from there. He was all about the superheroes. He learned to read through comics. My grandma evidently, or Mama as we called her, would sit down and read Superman comics with him, and that's how he learned to read. And that shit blows my mind, because have you ever read a Silver Age comic? That stuff is wordy. That's like a challenge to sit there, and you must really love comics if you want to sit there and learn to read through a fucking Silver Age comic. But I got the Superman action figure, and that was off to the races. The Superman action figure, I could even nail it down to the Superpowers line of action figures that it came from. And it had it was a reissuing of the, it wasn't the Superpowers Superman action figure, it was a reissue of that. And this reissue came with a magnetic kryptonite ring. You'd hold it up to Superman, he'd fall flat on his ass. And that was neat. So I collected all the DC superheroes from that line. They had Flash, Two-Face. It was all Toy Biz stuff too, now that I think about it. And from there it expanded to X-Men. And from there it expanded to just all the other superhero media that was around at the time. My dad used me as an excuse to get to watch all of that. We would go to the library, and at the time, Prism Videos had a series of VHS tapes. And I don't even think Prism's around anymore, but yeah, they had a series of Marvel-themed VHS tapes, and each one revolved around a different character. And I'd watch the 3 or 4 they had at the library, and I'd watch basically the 60s stuff where they made motion comics and would cut up Jack Kirby comics and make them move. So I watched like Thor, and I watched that really bad Fantastic Four series without the Human Torch. And like they had an episode on Magneto. I watched Pride of the X-Men. That was a big thing for me, especially as I talked about the X-Men figure line. Like around that time, Pride of the X-Men came out. I was huge into that. Spider-Man and His Amazing Friends. Batman the Animated Series. It was a lot of that stuff that drew me in as a kid. I can't tell you how many action figures I have. But my parents probably could have owned stock in Toy Biz. A lot of stock in Toy Biz with as many of those figures as we got. I collected any and all types of action figures up until 6th grade or so, maybe 7th. I switched primarily to wrestling figures around 6th grade. And before that, it was all action figures from Fantastic Four, from, if it had a TV show and an action figure, I probably had it. I was into all that stuff. I loved. I had some of the big sets. The one thing that I never got and I always wanted was the fucking Kenner Batman Batcave. That shit was so cool. And the fucking Batmobile. I wanted the Batmobile. All that stuff was from like the '89 Batman movie. And I remember as a kid just being like, "Oh man, that stuff!" Like I'd see a neighbor who had it, and it was just so cool to me. I felt like he had some of the coolest stuff, but I never had anything that cool. It wasn't until later when they had Spider-Man the Animated Series I got like the Daily Bugle and the New York skyscraper scene, or the Batwing and the Batmobile from Batman the Animated Series. Like that stuff was fun. I grew up in church, and there was a lot of talk of good and evil and morality, and superheroes were just an easy way to process a lot of that. A very black and white reinforcement of what I learned in church to a degree. And I would always bring in an action figure or two to church up until I was probably in first grade, and I would just play with a couple of them in church, in the pew. I'd be sitting there playing with them, having them fight each other and shit. And while my dad shared that stuff with me, I made it mine, because I would always have other kids come and play with me as opposed to me trying to go out and play with the other kids. And my whole world revolved around that stuff. Of course, as I got older, it became Power Rangers. I was into Power Rangers and some of the other trendy shit that kids were into, but the one thing that always remained were the superheroes. I've had people ask me what my first comic was, and that's a really, really tough question. I have memories of 3 or 4 different comics as a kid being my quote-unquote first. There was an issue of Flash. It was Flash Volume 279, and it's the last chapter of The Return of Barry Allen, where you have Wally West fighting the Reverse Flash, who was impersonating Barry Allen. I remember that vividly, and buying that off a magazine shelf at a gas station. Living in Ohio, we lived pretty far away from Mama's, who was in West Virginia. So we would we'd drive through there and take stops at gas stations, and I remember pulling that off the shelf at one of them. I also remember an issue of Detective Comics that I had when I was, probably 4 or 5. And it had a Matt Wagner cover, and I can't remember the exact, somewhere between 625 and 675. And it had a guy with a fucking spike on his head, and he was like a ninja, and he'd fucking wave around this crazy ass spike ball thing he had on his head. At least that's what I remember as a kid. I could totally be misinterpreting that. And I'm pretty sure, looking back on it now, that was Graham Nolan who did the art. And then, as I got older, I remember being in 5th grade, and at the time, they had launched Heroes Reborn. I'd moved to the 3rd city in Ohio that I'd lived in at that point. My dad being a pastor, he took different jobs at different churches, and we'd just travel along, and moved to a little town called Clyde, Ohio. And at this point, it was the very end of comics being in drugstores and on magazine racks. The dying days of that. And I would go to the local comic shop in a city called Fremont with this comic shop called Comics. And I'd buy action figures there as I got older. Because I came in there in 3rd grade. And as I got older, I started buying comics there. We'd go there. At first, we went there probably once every other month. But then at a local Walmart, I saw Iron Man #1. And then I found out they were relaunching Fantastic Four and Captain America and Iron Man and the Avengers. And so then it became regular trips to the comic shop. And I don't know if we were there every week, but we were there a lot. On a little side note, that comic shop was fucking awesome. It's still around if you go there. It's not the same as it was because they moved to a bigger building. And they also had a bootleg copy of Roger Corman's Fantastic Four film. So I watched that as a kid. And I remember thinking it wasn't bad. Boy, how childhood changes things. So back on track. I started collecting the Heroes Reborn stuff, and I read it religiously. Every month I was there with the new issue. As a kid, I guess you can't really count for taste. I didn't see how bad Rob Liefeld's art was. I didn't see how terrible the writing was in Avengers or Fantastic Four. I just saw new starts on these characters, and I said, let's go. And so I collected those, and then I even got into the Heroes Return. And I think I collected up until probably Thor issue 2 or 3. And got in through probably issues 5 or 6 of Kurt Busiek and George Perez's Avengers. And I collected all 4 of the titles that relaunched at that time. So as I read these comics, before I dipped out completely in those Avengers books, I discovered in the 2nd grade in the garage a ton of comic books. They were in boxes, and they weren't in plastic bags, but they were in like brown taped paper bags. And I remember looking through issues of X Factor and a lot of the old X-Men stuff and Legion of Superheroes. My dad about died when I found all those comics. But the big one that I always loved was Outsiders. I would sit there and I'd read that. Batman and the Outsiders. There would be days I'd be sick at home, and we had the comics out at that point because my dad was just like, well, forget it, I guess. If he's found them, there's, no point in it now. And looking back, they were all in pretty good condition. And so yeah, I mean, I would sit and read those. I remember reading The Dark Knight Returns, and my dad was very strict about content and about what was in the comics, or not what was in the comics, what I was watching, what I was seeing on TV, being in church. He didn't like Beavis and Butthead. He didn't like a lot of the more adult-oriented cartoons. I think even like the Goofy cartoon he wouldn't let me watch because there was something about heaven in it. They were very picky about that. And I set that up because one day I see The Dark Knight Returns, and he had all the single issues in our stack of comics. I said, Dad, is this good? And he just looks at me and goes, oh yeah, that's really, really good. So I read it, and I'm like 8 years old reading fucking The Dark Knight Returns, and there's all kinds of stuff in there, and I'm like you had a little gas bomb baby saying, calling someone a bitch, and all kinds of just violent shit with Joker breaking his own neck, and like it blew me away. And so I just thought, I was like, there's no way that does he not remember? How is he letting me read this? But I ate it all up. I loved all that shit. Around the time of Heroes Reborn, right as I was, and I followed this too and dropped it right around the same time as the Avengers books, was Superman getting electric powers, getting a blue suit with white electricity across it. and just getting a whole new power set. And I was way into that idea. I was like, yeah, this is pretty cool to see how Superman's going to adapt to all that. And I had very fond memories of that. And I followed that whole thing and bought all 4 Superman books for a couple years. Or no, it was about a year, because the whole storyline lasted about a year. In fact, I got in trouble one year taking the state tests at school because the instructions were like, write a letter. And that's all I saw. And I was like, who am I writing a letter to? And I remembered, there's letter pages in comics. I'm going to write to them about the latest issue of Man of Steel. Yeah, my teacher was not into that. She saw it and was just like, did you not read the directions? And I was just like, meh. Of course, she was more concerned because it reflected her job, but I couldn't have given 2 fucks less. So Superman got his spit curl back as the Avengers came back to the regular 616, as Batman the Animated Series was switching from Fox to WB. One Sunday night before church, we were about to leave and Dad flips on WCW, and I think it was worldwide. It was one of those syndicated shows. And so I catch it, and I just see it for like, I don't know, 5 minutes or so. My dad never watched wrestling as a kid, and it was like, I liked some of the colorful characters and the ideas of them, but I never really sat and watched wrestling. And here on WCW, I can't even tell you who was wrestling. I think maybe Jim Duggan. And that was another thing. I was like, oh my God, these dudes are beating the shit out of each other. This is awesome. And so I was hooked. But before I tell you any more about that, this is not life, listeners. We're going to have something pretty fun coming up these holidays. All 50 of them. Quite frankly, I want to give you all free shit. Now, Kevin, as much as I love you and I appreciate all that you do and the time you put into this, unfortunately, you can't qualify for this. And my lovely girlfriend, who you are always listening to this and giving me feedback, I'd be an asshole, I feel like, if I let you qualify for this too. But there's a movie called AQUAMAN coming out, and I have an original head sketch from former Aquaman artist Steve Epting. Epting took over Aquaman in the late 99, 2000-ish area. And if you don't know Steve Epting's art, he's great. He co-created The Winter Soldier and worked on Captain America a lot during that time. He drew the death of Johnny Storm. He's worked on Batwoman. I mean, you name it. But this is Aquaman with the full beard, straight up King of Atlantis, a head sketch by him. It's all pencil. I want to give this away. Not only do I want to give away that, but you have Kelly Sue DeConnick, one of the best writers right now in comics, in my opinion. I love her work. Bitch Planet, I love her Captain Marvel stuff, of course, was great. I mean, there's a bunch of stuff of hers that I've read and I've just really enjoyed. She did like a 3-issue run on Supergirl that was really good. And now she's coming up on Aquaman. Issue 43 is going to be coming out on December 14th, and I would like to give you a copy of that. In fact, you can pick whether it's digital or physical. You may ask, what do I got to do to get this awesome shit? Well, quite frankly, I need some love on iTunes. I need lots of love on iTunes. I was looking at my Podbean, and my Podbean's like, dude, you've had less than 500 listens since you've been doing this, and I think May is when I started. And that's not that many. Especially if you consider since May. And I'd like to up that. And I need your help. That's the big thing, is I need your help. So go on iTunes. Give me a 5-star rating. I beg of you. Write the best review. Whether it's funny, whether it's scathing. If it's a 5-star review and it tickles me deep in the cockles of my heart, you can win either a copy of Aquaman 43, the head sketch, or I can just straight up pay for your tickets to see Aquaman. So, I'm going to be giving away 3 prizes. There's going to be 3 people there who can win. And you could be one of 3. So do that. And I will announce the winner on the podcast. In fact, you have, 1, 2, 3, 4 weeks. You have 4 weeks to do this. So that's 4 episodes. I will be announcing the winner on Friday, December 21st. So you can hit me up, and right before Christmas, you get some shit for yourself. And it's at no expense. Just a few seconds, writing that 5-star review. I'll give you a shout out, and then you can DM me on Twitter or whatever. And that's all you got to do. So, hook it up, and I will hook you up with the King of Atlantis. So back to the secret origin of Adam the Wrestling Fan. I watched WCW Worldwide. Then I check out WCW Saturday Night the next week. And this time I watch more. And then before you know it, I start watching Monday Nitro. And my friends are talking about, oh, there's this Stone Cold guy that's super awesome running around. And my dad was like, yeah, you're not watching WWF. That's just not happening. But that was all right, because I enjoyed watching Sting beat the shit out of Hulk Hogan. I loved watching the NWO's bad guys. I was sucked in to the storyline of Sting Doesn't Talk. And I came in right in the middle of that. And I believe it was 1997. So you had Sting right in the middle of I'm Not Talking and I Want a Match with Hogan right before the epic Starrcade of that year. And I watched religiously ever since. Not ever since then, but I watched religiously for a few years after that. It was a fun time to be a wrestling fan. You never knew who was going to pop up in what promotion. People talk about the Attitude Era. People talk about like WCW and NWO, and I feel like they talk about it through rose-colored glasses because being a kid in that time, you bought into the storyline. While you knew it was kind of fake, you were able to completely suspend that belief way more than now as an adult. I didn't understand the ring psychology all the time. I didn't get that. I just saw the story between good guys and bad guys, and I got to know who was what and who was who. And it was a lot of fun. I remember being way into NWO Wolfpack. That was my shit. The first wrestling shirt I ever got was an NWO Wolfpack shirt. I loved that Sting joined NWO Wolfpack. I thought that they were awesome. I had all the wrestling figures. My dad loves this story because it was a time I was a dumb kid. So I see that WCW is releasing these massive plastic vibrating figures, but they were the only figures at the time. And I saw them on WCW's website, and they were like $15 each. And I was like, Dad, I gotta get one. And I think I got Sting or Hulk Hogan or Lex Luger, one of the three. And I was like, I haven't seen them in stores. They're not in stores. We got to get it here. And so he's like, all right. So he orders it. Literally, like the next week, they go to Walmart and they find a wall full of that shit for $5 a pop. Meanwhile, I'm over there mowing the grass, being like, I got to earn my allowance. And I got to pay 3 times what I would have paid at Walmart if I had just been patient. But I wasn't. But I ended up collecting all those figures. I had all the vibrating figures. After that, I had they did the original San Francisco Toy Company did a line of WCW stuff, and I had all those, as shitty as they were. And if they had variant figures, I got the variant figures. The video games, I had that. I remember getting a Nintendo 64 and playing WCW and WO Revenge for hours and hours and hours and hours. I was way into Goldberg, all the faces at the time I was into. The first time I ever got into a heel faction was after the 1998 Survivor Series, because I would watch the highly edited version of a weekly recap of WWE on Saturday mornings on USA called Livewire. And it was a highlight show. And I was way into The Rock. The Rock was my boy. He'd broke from the Nation of Domination, so he was cool now. And when he joined Vince McMahon's corporation, I was with him, and I was with the corporation. I was like, yep, the corporation's right. And The Rock is awesome. And so I totally was on the... I totally saw the bad guys as the good guys in that situation, because The Rock was there, and I mean, how could The Rock be wrong? And as everything eventually fades out, because everything has an ending, just like this podcast. In 1999, WCW had hit the shitter. I want to say it was maybe 2000, right as I stopped. It was the finger poke of doom. It wasn't long after that I was done. And after Bret Hart had gotten hurt. And they had the whole NWO 2000 bullshit. Like, all that, I was done. I was tired of WCW. I hadn't watched WWF. Although, at that time, by the time I kind of stopped watching, I got into PlayStation and had SmackDown 2, Know Your Role, and just played so much on that. But I just kind of fell out with wrestling after that. I remember one day, my dad took me to Subway, and he had a talk of people at church were highly offended that I watched wrestling, and so he was just kind of like, you know what, it's time to be done with wrestling. No more wrestling, kid. Somebody that had already left comic books behind because of wrestling. I really felt kind of without a rudder. I'd tried to gravitate towards music. I'd listen to CDs, and of course, as you know, growing up in church, there was the whole Christian music crap that I would listen to, and I went to a couple of Christian music shows, and it was good, especially at the time. I really enjoyed it, but nothing spoke to me like comics. Nothing spoke to me like wrestling. And the rest, I think the rest is a story for another day. So if you've made it through this episode, I want to thank you. I'd also like to thank Kevin, who has spent time editing this podcast. I'd like to thank Dandelion Massacre. Go visit them, dandelionmassacre.com. They provided the theme song. Dan Faughdner did our graphics and all the stuff you see, the logo, all that shit on my Twitter header. You can visit me on Instagram. You can visit me on Facebook. As I said, Twitter already. Basically, I'm everywhere. I'm on Reddit now. I'm on there all the time. I'm really easy to spot. All you got to do is just look up Adam S. Messinger, and I'm there. Oh, to reiterate before I leave you all, the AQUAMAN thing. Give me 5 stars on iTunes, please. So that way I can get you cool free shit. And then tell your friends, and your friends can go get cool free shit. So with that, thank you again for your time. I love you.